and it is kind of, it's something that I bring up in various classes. I teach about this in American foreign policy. I teach about this in my international relations course. I teach about this in terrorism. And so when I was asked to kind of give this presentation, I had to pull kind of different materials from different classes to kind of cobble it together. And kind of the way I'm going to approach it is I'm going to kind of give you like a history about the creation of the State of Israel. And then talk about how that creation of the State of Israel creates the Palestinian, the occupied territories. And then kind of then speed up a little bit to talk about Israeli politics under Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the, the Likud policies, empowering the settlers on the West Bank, and how this kind of all ties together, what Hamas is, and so kind of a basic overview. And once again, I'm usually teaching traditional age college students, so I'm used to them knowing, don't take this personally, nothing, right? And so you can kind of start from like ground zero. And I'm gonna expect that some of you do know. I mean, like, when we talk about some of these historical events, like the 67, the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War, these are things that some of you do know and followed, during the time period. And so I am, as I said, Professor Chris Cook. And so I got this little thing right here, and let's see if I got this. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. Dun, 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 dun. And so, in fact, did I skip over something? Yeah, actually I skipped over an important one here. One of the things I want to start with, and it is a basic thing, this is what makes it complicated. I do feel that Israel has a right to exist as a nation state. However, right, I do feel that the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. And I feel somehow in this today's day and age, like that becomes really complicated for people to understand, right? And so, as the crisis of the creation of the State of Israel creates the crisis of the Palestinian people, but all lives are important. Like and it really, I'm not going to ever celebrate the killing of any civilians, ever. And clearly, when we get to Gaza, the scope, the tragedy, right, of the Israeli response to Hamas is pretty big, right? And so, one thing, luckily, I've not really come across in my classes, but I think some of us can see this going on, maybe, and sometimes you have to watch about social media because they kind of amplify things or twist things for people's agendas, is that I will never tolerate anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And an important caveat to that is there's actually a lot of Christian Palestinians. And so I think it's important to also, when we talk about Islamophobia, we talk about Palestinians, and Hamas is an Islamic group, but not everyone in Gaza is Muslim. And in fact, Hamas's ruling council actually has a slot for a Christian, there's Christian representation in the Hamas ruling council. If that sounds strange, that's how the Palestinians work, because Christianity is a component of the Palestinian people. And so that's kind of the caveat I'm going to start off with. And so before I even begin, right, a discussion about October 7th, it's important to kind of discuss the various actors, right? And that creates kind of like, where does Israel come from? It is a modern country. It is a newer country. And contrary to what some Americans think sometimes, it's not the ancient country that you read about in the Bible. So this is a modern creation. And in fact, I think sometimes it's pointless to parachute right into a discussion of October 7th without knowing the background, right? The kind of historical context. And this is something actually that I think is very important that I do in my own classes, is that I'm a political scientist, but I have a very historically oriented class. The context becomes really important in any crisis that we talk about. And so Palestine is the original name, right, of that place, right? It's not called Israel, it's called Palestine. And so what is now Israel and Palestine, and in some ways there was a British kind of protectorate colony there that includes the country of Jordan as well. And I'll show you another map about that later. It is a region inhabited by Muslims, Christians, and Jews that historically were living in a kind of a checkerboard fashion, they were all living together as Palestinians. And it had been part of the Ottoman Empire. It's kind of the Levant region. And so starting in the 19th century, and influenced by anti-Semitism in Europe, and it's the same strands of anti-Semitism that will lead to the Holocaust, right? You start to see a movement of what's called the Zionist movement of Jewish immigrants pouring into Palestine. So on the and this is before World War II. In some ways, this becomes a problem, like it will eventually become a problem in Palestine because historically, these people here all live together peacefully. And so, in fact, students are sometimes surprised that there are Palestinian Christians, and I always explain to them, like Bethlehem, right? That is a Christian city, a Palestinian Christian city. And so, and that is on the West Bank. And so, Zionism, sometimes that people have been using that word a lot lately, but it is an interesting movement because in a lot of ways, it's connected to the nationalist movements of the 19th century. The same movements that kind of lead to the creation of Poland or Czechoslovakia, right? The after World War I. It's the Jewish people, and in some ways it becomes an ethnicity, not a religion. And a lot of the original Zionists are not religiously Jewish. They would consider themselves ethnically Jewish. And to jump ahead, Israel is founded by secular socialists, right? And so they're on actually to the left, which is interesting because today, right, we don't really, you wouldn't see that if you look at the left reaction today. But I mean, it's inspired by those waves of nationalism. And initially, not everyone that was a Zionist, did I just break the thing? Not everyone that's a Zionist is actually wants to go back to Israel, to go back to what they would call Israel. And so there's a lot of people there that actually are willing to go other places. And there is a discussion about creating a Jewish state anywhere else in the world. And so, as I see, let me do this here.
Source detect.
Ta-da! There we go. So that's the British Mandate of Palestine. And so to move along in history, the Ottoman Empire breaks apart during World War I, and you start to see the creation of Turkey, which is once again connected to nationalism, right? So the Turkish language, right? The Turkey is connected to these same nationalist movements that are going around in Europe. However, the rest of the Ottoman Empire gets picked apart by the Europeans, and the Europeans move in. So France gets Syria and Lebanon. Right? Because they are inviting themselves in, right? The British have control over this section right here. The British Mandate of Palestine, which is both Palestine and Transjordan. And so the British also get Iraq as well. And so during this time period, you see the Balfour Declaration from the United Kingdom. And so this is 1917. The foreign minister is Arthur Balfour, and the government releases this right here. His Majesty's government's view would favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. But you can tell right away, there's a problem here, right? Because what does it mean to have? In fact, this is really the issue of Israel. What is a Jewish state? And can other people live in a Jewish state? And so the British, in some ways, released this document, and there's a question about how much they actually believed it themselves or cared. A lot of Muslims and Christians, though, formed an association right after this and protested the Balfour Declaration. And they believed that the Balfour Declaration was a threat to their own nationalism. And that is Palestinian nationalism. In fact, I've got this quote later on. Prime Minister Golda Meir once stated, "There's no such thing as a Palestinian." She's wrong, right? And she has her own agenda when she says that. However, right, this is the start of a distinct Palestinian identity, right? That is both Muslim and Christian. And so the Jewish homeland issue, though, doesn't go away, and it picks up steam after the Holocaust. And so it does not, like, and I think it's, you know, I don't, how do I say this? The Holocaust does not justify the treatment and killing of innocent people. However, you cannot underestimate the impact of the Holocaust on the creation of the state of Israel. Because, interesting enough, what happens to like the early Israeli leaders is the lesson that you learn from the Holocaust is kill anyone who gets in your way. That's the lesson they learned. The lesson that you come out, the refugees that are now going to pour in are all concentration camp survivors. And to them, their only lesson is we need to always be vigilant, and we will kill anyone that ever gets in our way, because we'll never end up in a camp ever again. And by using that as an historical analogy, like as a historical lesson, does not justify what is going on today. But I think, it's important, to understand that mindset. The idea of well, how can a group of people that had suffered through the Holocaust basically, go off, right, and treat people this way, is because the lesson they ended up learning or internalizing is very different than you realize. Never again means, that's why the IDF, almost everyone in Israel has to be in the military between these men and women, right? It's a constant vigilant state that existed. And as we will tell, right, they made some bad mistakes during the years. At its peak in 1947, European Jewish displaced population reaches led by someone. Led by someone else.
Led by somebody else. Right now, the United States is not going to do it. It should, and a world without the United States in a positive relationship is a big problem. But
in the immediate future, I don't see that happening. In the long-term future, that always remains a possibility. And so in the immediate future, the United States plays a tremendous oversized role in Israel and Palestine. And that's an interesting discussion about Chinese foreign policy, is that they are reluctant to actually be leaders. And if you look at the People's Republic of China, at some point within 20 years of that country's founding, Mao Zedong put everything inwards, right? And so the discussion of what does a Chinese foreign policy and economy look like? So the Belt and Road thing is clearly tied in, and it is spreading. So for example, Chinese economic penetration of African economies is growing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you will find, and it does exist, that the Chinese actually come with more strings than the Americans. The Americans give you a lot of money, and then sometimes, if you spurn them, they just go away. The Chinese try to extract things out. It's transactional. It's even more transactional than the United States sometimes. And they will. They're in the Pacific Islands. We'll give you money to do this, but then you must do this for us in return.
Well, the United States, they've always been transactional, especially
in some places, yes. In some places, yes, absolutely. And in some places, not as much as you think it should, right? Where the United States would just pack its bags and go home and just lose money.
China also doesn't use domestic labor. They send Chinese firms or Chinese workers to do all of the work that they license out, and then when those companies can't repay, they steal the land. It's just another form of colonialism. The
Russian foreign policy, well, it sees how it's going to resolve the Ukrainian-Russian war resolves. But for example, the Wagner group, which was a private mercenary group, has basically been nationalized by Putin. And they play a role in that remain. Yeah, in fact, in case you are wondering, which is a little bit of an aside and connected but not, in my African politics class, I was telling students that Africa is really going to be the center of conflict in the future. The natural resources, a growing population, but also ground zero for climate change, right? And so when you factor these things in together, a few years ago, American special forces were killed in Niger fighting Islamists. Niger's also rich of uranium.
Uranium.
Yeah, uranium. And that's and the Congo is full of coltan, right? And like things that we need for our cell phones. And so like it becomes looming large in the sense of like overpopulation and climate change will create dissent, will create conflict. The United States will get sucked into that conflict, and you'll end up possibly like a Cold War situation where the Chinese and Russians pick one side of the conflict and the United States picks the other. And then you let them fight it out. And so the story of Angola, but the policies, it's like, you're right now the United States, I think, has a complete control. Like if the United States literally just said, we're pulling the plug on your money, that would immediately, Netanyahu would have to do something about it. Mm-hmm. He would. That's the end of story.
Yes.
And yet, the American domestic incentives for that to happen is zero.
Very, very small.
Yeah. And so sometimes, like, what seems obvious can't be obvious, right? When you factor in elections and and then it's sick to think about, right? Because you think national security would be so easy to understand. A humane security, like one that's caring towards people. And yet our perverse, like if we talk about Netanyahu's perverse incentive, Americans sometimes have a perverse incentive to keep conflicts going. So, I mean, right now, like, if you're wondering about Pitt, for the ones that our residents here from Cambria County that come, thank you for coming. I think one of the things, our students are, like, the insanity that you see on other campuses aren't existing on our campus. Pitt Johnstown isn't like that in a lot of ways. But like, when you go to some of these larger universities, which generate 20 to 30,000 students, you're getting a lot more, all kinds of, and I think some of the activism is not helpful on either side, right? To go back to like, we want a solution that respects everyone, people, humans, right? And you're getting this people dragged into the us against them mentality.
Yeah. It seems like you're getting almost a microcosm of Israel and Palestine on the campuses because they're all protesting against each other. Is that fair to say?
Some campuses.
Some campuses.
It seems like
sometimes I think it's overblown. Sometimes I think it's more overblown by the media than actually happening.
That's what I mean. Is it just the media, or is it actually turning into
the Cornell incident? If you've heard about the Cornell incident that someone had been threatening Jewish students, it was literally a random guy that has no connection to anything.
Oh.
That just was doing it. I think it was like a Chinese American student that has no connection to anything. It was just might have mental health issues.
So it's
and
just
was
flat
doing
out
that,
anti-Semitism that had nothing to do with anything political.
Yeah, it's not political. And so, the fact, as I said, the idea that people are now more aware of Palestinian issues today than ever in my life is a sign that there is change coming. Will change come fast enough? The Chinese coup of working out a deal between the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians.
It's quite amazing.
It was amazing, and it shocked Americans.
We'll have to see how it develops.
Yeah.
Because you don't really know what it means yet.
You don't. And I do know one thing about Saudi Arabia and the Iranians, and I think the Chinese don't understand this, is they'll eventually always just do what they want.
Well, they have really had great hostilities.
They did.
For many, many years, but they may.
It even predates the Islamic regime. They didn't like the Shah either. And so it is a long-term simmering feud between those two, which have been fought with, and that's the Yemen War. The Yemen War is a proxy war between these two groups. With everyone in Yemen suffering for it.
But it is possible that at least some significant forces in these countries can try to get a larger view of the situation than just thinking about their own situations. And you go back to the Treaty of Westphalia, where
remember this? We talked about the Treaty of Westphalia. You're taking that class next semester.
one of the
Treaty of
interesting
Westphalia.
things of the Treaty of Westphalia, and of course it wasn't necessarily implemented well, is that part of the treaty said you have to think of the interests of the other people. If you don't think of the interest of who you think your opponents are, you can never really have any kind of peace. And that was it. And that the Treaty of Westphalia, for all of its problems, helped maintain a certain kind of peace in Europe over many years.
You can go back even further to Thucydides, that all nations are basically moved by fear, honor, and interest.
You can.
Yeah, and that's
different than what.
Somewhat, because I think it is a recognition, which is why this lecture is mostly historical, right? And the questions and answers become speculative, right? The question and answers become different. Is that I cannot assume that, and this does not mean an insult to the non-students here. I just can't assume that any American knows anything about this. So the context is that recognizing that there are other interests and that people will follow their other interests becomes an important first step. Yeah, the important first step to then resolving conflict.
It's important to understand those other interests, but it's also important to think about how interests between people could find a way to find a mutual solution.
I hope. I hope.
Human nature looks prettier on paper than it does in practice.
I think part of the problem in Israel and Palestine is that there are dedicated groups to not finding that consensus.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and that, it's hard to get past that too. So.
I wanted to clarify something too, because I saw on social media before a video of a guy who I think the word, it's not immigrated because he moved out. Emigrated, I think is the word for it. And you have a Jewish guy with a New York accent taking over a Palestinian's home.
Yeah, those
screaming that he has the right to do it and everyone needs to butt out and mind their own business. So you're saying that's a whole movement and it's allowed under Israeli law, or
yeah,
it wasn't just a one-off thing?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some. I've not here in Pennsylvania. When I lived in California, I had a student. She was 23, and she had just fought in the IDF. She was from Beverly Hills.
Huh.
And at 18, she hopped on a plane, and her opinions about the Middle East were pretty bad. So she was always enlightening for crazy opinions. But she went and fought for another army. And so, yeah, she was all in. And so, any other questions? Yes.
Do you think that the United States government, not a people, have a double standard in the Middle East policy? For instance, the war in Ukraine and the conflict between Israel and Gaza, democracy, for instance, human rights. Do we have a double standard here? Or
yeah, and I'm going to clarify that with that I am a strong supporter of Ukraine sovereignty. I think the Russian war is illegal and immoral. But I also feel that the Israeli occupation immediately win, and in winning, they consolidate even more land, and they kick out Palestinians. Now, as I said earlier, the founding fathers of Israel were all leftists. And this is interesting because it does complicate American politics. Americans in the 1950s sometimes are a little bit split sometimes. And so one of the interesting things is that some conservatives in the United States were kind of opposed to the creation of the State of Israel. Different than today, because to them, Israel was full of socialists. That's Golda Meir right there. In her famous 1969 statement, she did an interview, and she said there was no such thing as a Palestinian. I have heard Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich say the same exact words. And so you can see how that framing of the situation, right, inspires how Americans then think about it throughout the years. And the Palestinian refugees thought they would be coming home, right? The war is over, they could go back to their villages. They were denied entry. And this expulsion in Palestinian history and memory is called the Nakba, right? And it's it is, in fact, this is something that plays throughout the years, because one of the contentions, the arguing points about an independent Palestine is, what do we do with all the Palestinians that are still in refugee camps in Lebanon or in Jordan? The right to return, right? The right to come home. And so that, the translation, the Arabic translation to that is usually catastrophe, right? They are forced out of their homes, they have to flee. Between 1948 and 1967, this is what the map would look like. It ends with an armistice between the Arab countries, not a peace treaty, but an armistice. They never, well, most of them still have not ever recognized Israel as a nation state. The West Bank came under the control of Jordan, which actually, when I do have some friends that are Middle Eastern experts, and I was talking to one of them as I was preparing this lecture. Actually, the Palestinians did not want that. You know what I'm saying? The Jordanians were going to just annex the place. And actually, the Palestinians didn't want that. And it's something that, like, when you hear people say, well, why don't the Palestinians just go to other places? Because they're all Arabs. Being Palestinian means being Palestinian. Right? So it doesn't mean you're Jordanian. Gaza came under the control of Egypt, which, as far as I can tell, kind of ignored the place. So the Egyptians made no attempt to annex it. They didn't seem to do much with it. And so that's all the way up to 1967, where you end up with the Six-Day War. In a poorly thought out plan, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel in 1967. They're easily defeated. Jordan thought about joining and actually backed out at the last minute. And they're the ones that end up losing the West Bank. So the Jordanians at the last second said, this is a bad idea. Syria lost the Golan Heights, which is located up here, which is strategic high grounds. It kind of sits above the Israeli border, and the Israelis wanted that. Israel was then able to move its capital to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and I'm going to talk about the American response to that in a second. And so this is a catastrophe, and it creates even more. In fact, this is what creates the modern occupied territories. In the Six-Day War, though, the Palestinians the Israelis thought they were going to flee. The Israelis were convinced, we come in, we take it over, they'll all get scared, they'll run away, and it's ours. They stayed. And there's now, at that time in 67, that's over 1 million Palestinians that are now living under an occupied territory. So in case you are wondering, like once again, this is not me, the international community believes strongly that this occupation is illegal. I think some of you are picking that up, right? When you were listening to how people are talking about this. It is considered an illegal occupation. And so no one fled, they all stayed. And so right now, right, and what ends up happening is, since there is, you're not Jordanian, so you don't have a Jordanian, like, what passport do you have? Like, what citizen are you of? What rights do you enjoy when you're living in an occupied place? And I think that's the question that Israel has never solved, right? And Israelis seem to just wish it goes away or something, and they're not going to leave. And so you also have refugee camps from the 47-48 war that got overrun in 67. And so the global community, including the United States has never officially recognized Israel's occupation until the Trump administration, and this was controversial. And I don't think a lot of Americans appreciated what was going on. The world community kept their embassies for all the people that had recognized Israel in Tel Aviv, because Jerusalem's considered part of the occupied territories. And though the Israelis treat Jerusalem as their capital, everyone else kept their embassies officially in Tel Aviv. Under President Trump, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And then the discussion then becomes, does this signal a change in U.S. policy? Does this embolden the Israelis, right, if they wanted to annex and keep large parts of what will be the West Bank and Gaza? The Yom Kippur War, Egypt and Syria fought another war, and they lost again. And so Israel seized the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. So this is a New York Times article from October of 73. Israelis strike back in force, report 9 of Suez bridges cut. They seized the canal. In fact, the United States, actually the Nixon administration, convinced the Israelis not to bomb Cairo. And so they used that as a bargaining chip with Egypt in the Camp David Accord. And what the Israelis did is that they traded the Sinai Peninsula back. This is Anwar Sadat, the president that succeeded President Nasser. And there's Menachem Begin right there, right? And they signed this treaty where if Egypt officially recognizes it, so Egypt officially recognizes Israel as a state. And I actually just went over this in my international relations class today. What happened to President Sadat?
Dead.
Is assassinated by the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which is the forerunner to Al-Qaeda. And as I was telling my students, his death is probably the first real incidence of the jihadist terrorism, right? His death in 1981 is really the start of like the jihadist terrorism that would lead to Al-Qaeda. And part of the reason he's killed is the anger about signing the Camp David Accord here with President Carter. The Palestinian people never accepted the occupation or any of this. They just, you know what I'm saying? Like, and this is also frustrating too. The Palestinian people always felt they had no voice. And so the refugee camps became training grounds for the Fedayeen, the rebels early on. Attacks began against Israel almost immediately. And at this time period, like, it is interesting to note, in fact, since I tell you, I've taught terrorism plenty of times, the word terrorism has actually subtly changed definitions over the decades. So if you were reading US newspapers in the 1960s, the Viet Cong would be referred to as terrorists, rebels, or insurgents interchangeably. The term would change around. It wouldn't have a fixed meaning. Here, the Palestinians are not seen as terrorists. And you may not call them freedom fighters, but they're actually, right, they're part of now the decolonization movements, right, that are affecting Africa and Asia. And most people see the Palestinians as not terrorists, but just rebels. And the reason why is because a lot of people do have sympathy at some level with the claims that the Palestinians were thrown out of their homes. And so it is an ongoing thing. And the interesting thing is that Israel, you have a country that is created in the shadow of the Holocaust, and then they basically create a nation that has automatically, at birth, created a security problem. And so Israel has become a highly securitized state. And so in Jordan, roughly 2 million refugees still live in the country out of a population of 9.7 million people. That's a lot. 1970-71, the Palestinian refugees almost overthrew the Jordanian government. In fact, that's where the spin-off group of the PLO, and these are the people that committed the Munich massacre in the 1972 Olympics, got their name from, because it occurred in September when they tried to overthrow the government. And so that's part of it. Then you have in Lebanon about 500,000 people. What the Lebanese eventually did is that all Christian Palestinians were awarded Lebanese citizenship. Later on, the Shia community got Shiite Palestinians, and there's less of them because most of them are Sunni, but they were also given Lebanese citizenship, leaving the Sunni Palestinians with nothing, but they're still living refugees. Syria, another 500,000 refugees. In Saudi Arabia, about 240,000. Here's a UN map of refugee camps, and there's another refugee camp in the next thing. And so one of the things, and to say this does not justify violence, but imagine growing up in a refugee camp in an occupied place, or your home has been occupied. How does that make people feel? And I it's hard to say, right? Because sometimes I tell students when I was their age, I actually didn't really think about Israel and Palestine. Because there actually was no counter narratives. There's no counter arguments. You're just like, oh, that just happened. But today, when you actually think about it, like when I tell students, like, think about the United States. We live in a country that celebrates the gun. Right? Well, if someone threw you out of your house, and I'm not saying I like this. And I'm saying but that's what radicalizes people. And I always point this out. Sadat got killed by Islamists that are not Palestinians. This form is violence is different, right? There's different forms of what will become terrorism. And you've got to make sure that the Palestinians overall are always secular. It's a secular form of violence, very different than what you see after 9/11. So there are refugee camps, Gaza, the refugee camps in Gaza, refugee camps in the West Bank, refugee camps in Jordan. And they have been there now longer than I've been. Because that's what happens when you've been there for 50 years. You permanently create homes, you permanently create things. And so this is an example, I'm going to come back to this map later, of the loss of Palestinian territory over time. 1946, 1947, 1967, and as I'll talk about, the expansion of what's called the Jewish settlements into the West Bank especially, which is very controversial, right? Has been leading to the loss of less and less Palestinian land. And so I always point this out. When you used to say the word terrorism, you probably thought about that guy, Yasser Arafat. And so he was the chairman of the board, right, of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is an umbrella organization of various Palestinian groups. There is no one voice for Palestinians. They're a diverse community with different interests, and even throughout their struggle, there's different Palestinian groups. So the PLO also included, well, he's part of Fatah, but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Black September, right? And so there's these different groups that exist under the PLO umbrella. Arafat made a famous speech at the United Nations. He was invited by the UN. He got in a fight on the way to the floor because he wanted to bring his gun. They told him you can't bring a gun onto the floor of the General Assembly. And his famous statement is, "Today I come bearing an olive branch in one hand and the freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. I repeat, do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." And so Arafat becomes the symbol, right, of Palestinian resistance throughout the 1970s. And if you're American, he is the face of terrorism. Right? When you think about when you say the word terrorism in the Middle East, you always would turn back and think about him in the PLO. Now, on a side note, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was actually created by a Christian, George Habash, and they're Marxist-Leninists. In fact, some of you are familiar, I don't know, I'm curious, how many people remember Carlos the Jackal? Yeah, one of the world's famous, like, he was part of the PFLP. And so he was charged, they actually kidnapped an OPEC meeting, which is the foreign ministers of all the OPEC members. He kidnapped the entire meeting. And he got in trouble because he was supposed to kill the Saudi foreign minister, and the Saudi foreign minister paid him off. And so he didn't kill him. And then the PFLP fired him. They're like, you didn't do your job. Layla Khalid, in fact, her specialization was airjacking. She hijacked planes. And the interesting thing is she went on to become a member of the Palestinian legislature. And it's because they were Marxist-Leninists, they had no problem with women's roles. Right? They're not. In fact, George Habash, when he died about 15 years ago maybe, Greek Orthodox, had a full-on Greek Orthodox funeral mass. And it was attended by like a who's who of like Palestinian terrorists. Muslim or not, it did not matter. They came out of respect to him as a Palestinian and what he did for the Palestinian people. The more famous events, because what actually happens is the Palestinians now realize if you hitch your wagon to the Arab states, you're getting screwed. Like, if you keep relying on Egypt and Syria, they'll keep losing. Mm-hmm. And so it changed their strategy, and they really doubled down on terrorism. Hijackings, assassinations, bombings, the murder of the 72 Israeli Olympic team, which is a little bit more complicated because they actually didn't set out to kill the Israeli Olympic team. They were going to kidnap them and ransom them off for someone else, and then the Germans screwed up the counterterrorism operation. There was, in fact, during the 80s, a spin-off of the PLO, the Abu Nidal organization, actually hijacked a cruise liner in the Mediterranean. They killed an American, Leon Klinghoffer. And so you can see, actually, Abu Nidal's plane was then intercepted by American fighter jets and diverted to Italy. And that caused actually an international legal issue there. I'll briefly give you the bad news on that one. The terrorists that were on this plane were in Egypt, and they were given safety, right, to release the hostages to be flown to Libya. The United States interdicted the plane midair, forced it to Italy, to an American Air Force base, and then the Americans said all the non-terrorists should get off the plane. Everyone got off the plane, including the terrorists. And so the other thing about Nadal, I always thought, he ended up dying. Actually, he was in Baghdad during the US invasion. And he got killed by the Iraqis because the Iraqis were going to arrest him and turn him over to the Americans to stave off the invasion. In an attempt to stave off the invasion. But the thing that Nadal, I always tell students, he was a radical atheist. Didn't believe in God at all. And as he talked about in his life, he said, I was a kid, I was living in my house, these Israeli soldiers came, they threw me out of my house, and I'm going to vow the rest of my life to go get them. And so that, once again, that does not justify violence. But you start to see the impact of how, like, the mentality of why they do what they do. The Palestinians also used Lebanon, the Lebanese border, to attack Israel. So Israel invades Lebanon in 1982 and cuts out an occupation zone in southern Lebanon. And one thing I want to point out is the only practical outcome is it actually creates Hezbollah. In some ways, its constant need for security will always create insecurity. Because unless you solve the most fundamental problem, the occupation, right, you're going to keep generating violence. That included a massacre of Palestinians in the refugee camps that were carried out by Lebanese Christian groups. And if you know anything about Lebanon, that place is just, what I always tell people, like, you can teach a class on Middle Eastern politics, you would need a separate class just for Lebanon. Because whatever goes on there is just crazy, right? And so the concept, like, Israel just keeps expanding out, right? Because it's constantly worried about security. The goals of the PLO and the Palestinian people are easy to understand. They advocate self-determination for the Palestinian people. They want the UN General Assembly resolution to be recognized, that they can come back, national independence and sovereignty, and they want to be recognized, the PLO want to be recognized as the sole voice of the Palestinians. And so now we have to come to what is Hamas. Because Hamas is not part of the PLO. And the PLO, for years, was the face of Palestinian resistance. And so Hamas is the Islamic resistance movement. Hamas is kind of an acronym, Arabic acronym. And there's like another letter form put in, so it's its own little name. Was originally an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brothers. The Egyptian Muslim Brothers are actually non-violent. This group became violent. So this spin-off actually took its own path. They are religiously fundamentalist, and they really took shape during the first Intifada. Shake off, right? That means the first uprising. And what happens for the Palestinian people is, so if terrorism doesn't work, what do you do? So massive civil disobedience, protests, shutting everything down, right? And so they were often seen as less corrupt than Arafat's PLO, and that's going to play a role when they ended up getting elected later. And so Oslo, which it's funny now that I think about it, like, I remember like thinking like, like a page is turned, things are going to get better, and then you kind of end up with this situation right here. Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin from the Labor Party, both sides agreed that the Palestinian Authority would be established, assume governing responsibilities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip over a 5-year period. Then permanent talks on the issues of borders, refugees, and the status of the city of Jerusalem, right, would be decided at a later point. And that's 1993, and I thought, well, this is good. Things are changing. Hamas was excluded from Oslo because they have always refused to recognize Israel. The PLO recognized Israel as a legitimate state, and that sets off the negotiations. Hamas has never officially recognized Israel in any capacity, so they're excluded. And to also let you know, the Arab states do not like Hamas. The Arab states like Arafat. They liked Fatah.
I've read that actually Israel had a role in creating Hamas.
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Now we'll talk about Netanyahu secretly funding Hamas.
Yes. Okay.
And so they then set about trying to undermine Oslo, right? By launching terror. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to talk about how the Israelis undermined Oslo. So,
Okay.
right? But here, Hamas tried to undermine Oslo by launching terrorist attacks. This is from a 1996 State Department report. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, suicide bombs in February and March killed 65 people. What they're doing is they're angry that they were left out of the process. They are now intentionally trying to sink the Israeli government. Right? They are trying to create, right, a conflict. Palestine today, and once again, I'll get to the Israeli side in a minute. Today, Palestine is sometimes treated as a virtual state, complete with virtual state of the UN. Fatah became a political party, but it's still a very corrupt party. And then, its autonomy is always the Palestinian autonomy is always being challenged. Fatah was eventually challenged politically by Hamas, which also became a political party. Hamas in the past has funded schools and hospitals. And so here's another complicated thing. You can both be a violent organization and an organization that provided public services to people. And so Arafat did not produce public services to people. They stole a lot of things. Hamas came along actually and said, well, we're going to do these things. And what you're obviously is you start, and this is years before, right? This is a long time ago. They are actually, a lot of Palestinian poor people definitely felt more affinity towards Hamas. And this is how they win. You might have heard this in the news. You might remember this. They won the Palestinian election in both the West Bank and in Gaza in 2006. The Palestinian people were upset with the PLA, Fatah, corruption, voted in the religious party. Fatah held the presidency, but they lost the legislature. And so it's kind of weird to have this discussion right now, but the United States and Israel then punished the Palestinians for voting for the wrong people. And I think this is, well, in today's light, you'd say, well, good. But back then, you have to realize if the United States promotes democracy, what do you tell people when you crush them for voting for the wrong people? And so at this juncture, Hamas had stopped terrorist attacks. They're not attacking Israelis at this juncture. This caused a fight to break out between Fatah and Hamas. Today, Fatah controls the West Bank, and Hamas controls the Gaza Strip. Gaza is under an incredibly intense embargo. Like nothing comes in or out of Gaza for years now. Right? The West Bank is a little different, and that has its own set of issues with Israel. But to give you an example, the Israelis would free Fatah prisoners so they could join the Palestinian army so they could go fight Hamas. And to kind of come back to you, it's like divide and conquer. The Palestinians actually want to keep these two groups at each other.
Palestinians? No.
The Israelis, I'm sorry, the Israelis. The Israelis want to keep these two groups together. They actually don't want them to actually solve their differences. And so, there's never been another election in Gaza. And of the more than 2 million people living in Gaza today, roughly half are under the age of 18, meaning these people could not have voted for Hamas in any capacity anyway. They're too young. So when people say, well, this is what the Gazans get for voting for Hamas, you can't claim that people under the age of 18 were voting in anything for that. And so, why am I going there? I'm going the opposite direction. Here we go. On the other side, the Israeli right-wing one to undermine Oslo And Labor Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-winger in 1995. And that's an Israeli terrorist, right? That's an Israeli assassination on the Israeli Prime Minister. Because the right wing was just, they did not accept Oslo. In the 1996 election, because as Hamas starts ramping up its suicide attacks, it becomes a contentious issue in Israel. They have to hold a new election. They had to get another prime minister. That's where Benjamin Netanyahu becomes the new prime minister in 1996. He hailed from the Likud party, which is historically opposed Palestinian statehood and withdrawal from the occupied territories. He worked to delay, postpone, and stymie Oslo the entire time. And he made, in fact, he intentionally did that. He would be prime minister from 1996 to 1999, then again from 2009 to 2021, and then again in December of 2022. And so Netanyahu, like, this was a Likud party propaganda pamphlet that was passed out to people. That's Yitzhak Rabin. What are they trying to convey by calling Rabin a Nazi? Yeah, like, he's selling out the Jewish people by signing that accord. So it's funded by, in 1970, Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon. Like its landslide victory in the 1977 elections was a major turning point because it's the first time the Israeli left lost. And in some ways, there really is no organized Israeli left anymore. There is an Israeli peace movement. There are lots of Israelis that support Palestinian self-determination. Like, do not get me wrong, but the organization of Israeli politics is set up that it's almost impossible for them to cobble together a majority coalition in their parliament. And so, Netanyahu makes the claim that he was the only one that could protect the Israeli people from attack, and then he likened counterterrorism to just mowing the grass, as in routine. One of the things I do talk about in one of my classes about counterterrorism is the Israelis like to say they're very good at counterterrorism. It's because it will never end. It will never end there. Because it's what he wanted to do was reduce Palestinian violence to just regular and routine, and that the Israelis would always be able to control it. And so it wins with a coalition of small, fringe right-wing religious and nationalist parties. United Torah, Judaism, Shas, Religious Zionist Party, Otzma Yehudit, Noam and National Unity. Many of them represent the West Bank settlements. And so the West Bank settlements are treated like Israeli citizens. They can vote in Israeli politics, even though their settlements are in occupied territory. And that becomes the key to Netanyahu's electoral coalition. And it's because it's the key to his electoral coalition, he always wants to make them happy. And so you get the whittling away. More than 700,000 settlers, 10% of Israel's nearly 7 million population, now live in about 150 settlements and 128 outposts. The settlement is authorized by the Israeli government. An outpost is built without government authorization. And Netanyahu eventually pulled the military off the Israeli Gaza border because all of these settlements have angered Palestinians in the West Bank. And so violence in the West Bank has spiked, and it is these settlers, a lot of them are religious fanatics. In Israel, Tel Aviv is a modern secular city. And a lot of Israeli citizens identify themselves as ethnically Jewish, but not necessarily religiously Jewish. The settlers are always religiously Jewish. And I've met people who tell me that their crazy Jewish cousin, they're Jewish themselves, moved to the West Bank. There's a lot of Americans in there. And they are violent. They've gone in, they've just taken over Palestinian homes. They've built boundary walls for their settlements, which have actually cut off Palestinians from their farms. Like one guy lost his olive, what do you call it? Like the trees, grove, yeah. Because they built a wall, like the Israeli settlement just built a wall to cut them off from the grove. And so that is going to be an issue, right? The settler population is not distributed effectively to secure Israel's dominance over the territory. And so this is kind of, I think, what we're talking about is that Netanyahu made it pretty clear anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. That's 2019. That's an Israeli newspaper. That is a center-left newspaper in Israel. But what Netanyahu is clearly saying, he's saying the quiet part out loud. I'm going to send support to Hamas, and just enough support to keep them there, right? In a way to always challenge Fatah, which controls the West Bank. Netanyahu also faces trial for bribery, fraud, breach of trust charges. And in fact, look, I guess, well, he's not an American, because I can't say he's innocent until he's proven guilty. It doesn't look good for him. And the only reason that he's not in jail is because he's prime minister. Because he gets parliamentary immunity. And so his government has been pushing constitutional reforms that will gut the independence of Israeli courts. His coalition partners want it because they are religious fanatics. They want to make the country more religious. He wants it because it'll get the charges against him dismissed. And that set off tremendous protests in Israel. Historic. Gallant is their defense minister. Reportedly says judicial overhaul might push him out as defense minister amid reports of growing wave of reservists' refusal to serve. Like, it actually threatened the Israeli Defense Force. The amount of protests undermined the Israeli state security. Because basically people saw it for what it is. It is basically Netanyahu is trying to stay out of jail. And they're going to change the Constitution in a way that will no longer be an independent judiciary. And to them, they didn't want that. And so one headline, hundreds of Israeli reservists vow to refuse service. And in light of what happened on October 7th, you got to realize this is this year. So the amount of incredible anger towards Netanyahu that is going on. So what is their reasoning? So to come back to Hamas, though, what is their reasoning for October 7th? It's similar to what happened after Oslo. And what I mean is that if you've been paying attention to Middle Eastern politics, the Abraham Accords or Saudi Arabia is that the Arab states over time eventually stopped. Well, in fact, there's an argument whether they ever cared about the Palestinian people at all either. I think the people in these countries care. I think the average citizen of almost any Arab country or Muslim country in the world has incredible sympathy for the Palestinian people. Their governments are another story. And so the Abraham Accords, right, part of that dual agreement, both the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain recognize Israel's sovereignty, enabling the establishment of full diplomatic relations. The U.S. has also been working with Saudi Arabia to normalize it. This is I can just tell you now, Joe Biden was so close, right, to getting Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. And you knew he was going to ride that through the 2024 election. It's dead. And what Hamas was cut out of all this. They're cut out of all this, and they didn't want to be, they don't want that. If the Arab states had historically failed to recognize the state of Israel because of the Palestinian issues, what happens to the Palestinian people when the Arab states The Israelis are not very good at negotiating. They don't really care about hostages. But if you do this, there is only one predictable response from Israel. And it doesn't matter whether it's the correct response or the humane response or whether you will know what Israel will do. Crush it. And that's what Hamas wanted. Because what they're trying to do is kill those peace talks cold. They're trying to get the Arab states to start being serious about the Palestinian people. And that's a tough thing, right? I think one of the things I talk about 9/11 is, why did Al-Qaeda attack the United States on 9/11? They wanted the United States to invade Iraq. And what did the United States do? Invade Iraq. Right? They wanted the United States to come in, right, and crush everything, which would start some giant uprising. Here, That is their kind of rationalization. As for Israel, Israel was caught unprepared, partially because Netanyahu was too focused on staying out of jail. He did not listen to intelligence reports. His country is consumed with corruption. He weakened the border with Gaza. He even strengthened Hamas to divide the Palestinian people. In fact, one of the sick incentives we have right now is, in some ways, he wants the combat to keep going. Right? Because when that conflict's over, there's a general election in Israel and he's gone. So in some ways, he's got a perverse incentive now just to keep it going. Because it really doesn't look good for him. He could end up in jail, right, when this war is over. And so an Egyptian intelligence official says Israel ignored repeated warnings of something big. There is communication amongst these states now in a way that did not exist even 20 years ago. Right? That's the times of Israel, right? And so the Israelis, I think, there's going to be a reckoning coming, right, when this conflict's over in Israeli politics. The Palestinian people, and I felt this for a long time, is that they are just pawns to these games. And I have such tremendous sympathy for them. They are afraid to leave, as I said, because if they ever leave Gaza, there's actually an historical record of Israel never letting them back. In fact, I was reading just today, and I didn't get into this thing, there are already Israeli right-wing political parties that are planning to basically plant settlements in Gaza. They're already salivating of the idea of a Palestinian-free Gaza. And that doesn't help anything either. And that's not all of Israel. Those are the right-wing parties. And so there are other regional issues here as well. And in some ways, you could spend hours talking about this. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim organization, but in a twist, gets a lot of support, and at least moral support sometimes, from Iran. Because the Arab Sunni states will always support Fatah. The Iranians who are Shiite and also are invested in Jerusalem as well, their entree into this issue would be Hamas. Hezbollah is connected to Iran. And so they are sitting, like the question now becomes is, if a wider war, I don't think so. I don't think a wider war is going to break out. But, if Israel goes into Lebanon, it's going to be a mess. And it's just not going to end well for anyone, right? I think the Iranians are blustering. I don't think they're going to actually get involved. But I mean, you do realize that Netanyahu is always telling all the American presidents to always bomb Iran. Oh, always. And so finally, as long as the Palestinian people live in occupied territories, there is always going to be some form of resistance. It's not rocket science. You're never going to end terrorism. You're never going to end violence as long as you keep people occupied. And to me, I think that's an objective truth, right? And it doesn't mean I want people to be killed. The idea of massacring a bunch of kids at an all-night rave, an all-night club, right, is not speaking truth to power. But you have to then realize that until this occupied territory is solved, Israel's never going, there will always be the potential of violence in Israel. And so on that note, I will open it up to any questions. I packed a lot in.
Since Palestine doesn't have an established government, who are they supposed to negotiate with?
Palestine actually has a government, the Palestinian Authority. The problem is that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority had a falling out. I think the question is, and this is the controversial one, is, and it's changing, we don't have a good snapshot of actual public opinion of Palestinians in Gaza. And at some point, Hamas was a legitimate voice of some Palestinians. And so any long-term deal at one point had to include Hamas. And Israel would just say no. And even the Palestinian authorities, like, look, we have to include them too, because they also represent Palestinians. After this, I don't, like my fear is that Israel's not going to stop till they convince themselves they killed everyone. Right? And here's the, in fact, here's the,
all the Palestinians out of revenue.
yeah. And then after they empty the place out, they'll say, well, we got Hamas. They haven't, like, and here's the, in fact, the other ironic thing, like, the Israelis have a problem in the West Bank because the Israeli settlers, have stepped up the violence in the last month. They've seen this as their invitation to do things. And that is not helping the Israeli. In fact, it just completely undermines, I think, any long-term Israeli goal of, like, because who is their voice? The problem of Hamas, as I said, they haven't had an election since 2006. I mean, if there was an election last year, who's to say Hamas could have been thrown out of office? Like, I'm saying, could have, like, other people could have taken over, right? We don't know. And we don't have a good snapshot. I think you understand the anger, but there's a lot of complex feelings. And I'm saying, like, there are people that hate Hamas but are kind of glad what they did. There are people that hate Hamas and hate what happened. There are people, I'm saying, so it's like it all breaks down into kind of many different groups. And so that's who speaks for yeah, it's tough to say who speaks for them.
I've been following since the early 70s when I became politicized over the Vietnam War. I've been following U.S. just endless wars. I mean, and gross wars. We're never considered a terrorist, of course. But I have to wonder what our agenda is in Israel, not just regarding this issue of the moment, but long term. I mean, we never go into a country and spend billions of dollars a year because we care about helping out the everyday people of those countries. I mean, when we invest money in a country, we're expecting a return on our investment. And I see it really as us maintaining our global hegemony for economic reasons and things like that. But
it's complicated. And so I partially agree with you and I partially don't, because I'm trying to think about, one way I'll say this, I think American policy is changing. There's generational change. Since you've been following this conflict, you now know there are far more Americans who are aware of the Palestinians than ever before. Right? Like, so right?
Yeah,
like
46% of Democrats are opposed to what's happening right now.
I mean, like, if I gave this lecture even 10 years ago, my students would have zero knowledge. You know what I'm saying? Like, and in fact, most Americans could care less, because in some ways, I was telling the students that when I was in college in the early 90s, it was always framed as Israel versus the Arabs, and the Arabs were always all of them. So they were seen. You saw Israel as the underdog, right? And the Arabs were all beating up on little Israel, and the Israelis had suffered the Holocaust, right? So that's the way it was framed in the United States for a lot of us. When you start to look at the facts, they're not pretty for Israel, right? It is an occupied territory. The U.S. policy, though, I think it's changing. And you said that point, that is true. I think there's going to be a reckoning. And I'm not justifying President Biden, for example. In some ways, I'm sure he is, and him and Blinken are on the phone yelling at Netanyahu. Netanyahu doesn't care. And so the real question then becomes, do you put your money where your mouth is and take the money away? Right? Do we pull the plug on the funding? Because Israel is one of the largest recipients of foreign aid. They're not a poor country. Like, giving aid to Zimbabwe would make sense, right? That's a poor country. And also, that's a country that got screwed over by South Africa, right? And so, like, but you say, they're not poor. They're a rich country. We give them a lot. So and you know what ends up happening is, and we're just stuck in this moment here. We cannot have an honest discussion as long as like this country has to view everything with either, if you don't support Israel, you're a Nazi. You get that crowd, right? Or like, if you don't support Israel, Jesus can't come back. We all can't go to heaven. Get that crowd. You know what I'm saying? Or just people that hate Joe Biden want to see him lose an election, so they're just gonna take the and think about it. If President Trump was doing the same thing as President Biden, some of the people criticizing Biden would be fine with it. Right? And so it gets dragged into our partisan politics. But I mean, it is clear, I think October 7th, if this is any silver lining, I guess, is that the current status quo cannot remain. Israel's relationship to the United States is interesting because it is a rich country. It is not completely like, there are other countries we have the patron-client relationship where you are given money and you're basically told what to do. That exists. Israel and I mean, in some ways, Israelis do have their own agency, and they do make their own decisions apart from the United States. And actually, Netanyahu, I think, is going to make decisions that one of the things the Israelis are now realizing is it's not just young people in America or 47% of Democrats. There's a lot of American Jewish people that are sick of this now. Right? This is not what this is supposed to be. And that is actually something unheard of 30 years ago. I once gave a talk similar to this years ago at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and it was like a summer camp for old rich people. And a lot of them are from New York. And I can remember this. There was a woman there who kept referring to Israel as my Israel, which would be common for people that age, of Jewish Americans that age. Because it was 30 years ago. So I'm saying like her understanding of that conflict is much, she kept referring to my Israel. And I was like, I don't really get that. She did, but that was 30 years ago. And the new generations, there is more awareness, and you cannot, in fact, the thing about social media is you cannot hide that innocent people are being crushed. You can't hide that anymore. The Palestinians that got killed in those refugee camps in '82, we didn't hear about that until later, right? And so we are watching a conflict in real time. And it's the Israelis, they may think that everything's normal, but when this ends, there's going to be a reckoning, I think. I think it is up to Americans, like, for example, like you, to keep talking about it, right? I mean, because you can't forget. Here's another thing. This conflict will eventually end. And a lot of Americans will just drift off back to being whatever. But the Palestinian people still exist, right? And until they solve that occupied territories, right, there's still going to be anger there.
You talked about, pardon my voice, I had a little problem. Israel being a rich country, how? And how is it that it's advantageous for the United Arab Emirates to normalize with them?
Israel it's in some ways considered like a Western country. So when we talk about Western countries, sometimes the definition isn't the literal global north or the west. In fact, you use global north sometimes to include Japan, right? And Australia, New Zealand. Israel is technologically advanced. Its standard of living is high, right? I'm saying, like, it has a low poverty rate. And so it is not in any way, shape, or form, like poverty in Jordan is significant compared, right? Poverty in the surrounding countries can be significant. Israel does not have that. And so the Israeli economy is a tech economy, like it's a very advanced economy, highly educated, and that's kind of what I'm saying is like and so the United Arab Emirates. So basically, what has happened is that a lot of Arab countries, over time, stopped caring. Like, for a lack of a better word, the government stopped caring. I'm not saying the people. The government said it is advantageous to us to just work out a deal. One of my problems of the Abraham Accords, and people will say, well, you're just doing that because you don't like President Trump. No, but my problem with the Abraham Accords is it basically allowed every Arab nation to take whatever their favorite issue is, and we just absolve them of it. So I'll give you an example. Western Sahara is something that I actually care about as well. And there's an independence movement in Western Sahara. The Moroccans don't believe there's a Western Sahara. So the deal that Trump made is America will do a 180. We'll throw the Western Saharans under the bus. You recognize Israel. You work on a better relationship with Israel. And that was my critique of the Abraham Accords, is that they all lined up and said, here's our, and that's the Camp David Accord. I mean, President Carter, who I'm actually amazed is still with us, right? I mean, part of the Camp David Accords, which is seen as a very momentous event, is he gave money to Egypt and Israel. in perpetuity, right? I mean, there's no end to the money, right? I mean, like, and the Egyptian government stole it, and it never filtered back down to people. And the Israelis can use it in different ways, and they ended up using it in the military. The Israeli military historically, right, is, how many people like have ever heard about the raid at Entebbe? I mean, it built up this illusion of like invincibility of the Israeli military, right? Their ability to like, they just went in and flew into Uganda and like freed a bunch of hostages that had been taken by a bunch of German terrorists and Palestinian terrorists. But I mean, Israel is struggling, right? Because like at some point you're trying to watch them blow everyone up, and the world isn't having it. And there is pressure on that government. It is a democratic government. Well, Netanyahu is not really very much of a Democrat. I mean, like, but as I said, he can't let this conflict end unless, like, because it's going to be poorly for him. That's my opinion, I guess. It's not that's what, is not going to happen. But does that answer your question? Like, yeah, the Arab states all have a vested interest. And the governments themselves no longer care about the Palestinian people, which I think is why Hamas acted the way they did. Because you can, what is the United Arab Emirates going to do when the Israelis are just killing innocent children? Yeah. Oh, they like the goodies we gave them, but the people are going to say, what are you doing?
Yeah. Why is everyone pushing for people to recognize Israel? Because it seems like getting Palestine represented is more important than negotiating peace, because they don't really seem to be on the same page.
You can't. They have to come together. In fact, the historic Arab position, as it evolved, wasn't. There is no such thing as Israel. There's only Palestine. Then it switched to a two-state solution, where you would have to recognize both simultaneously. And then eventually it's now become, well, we can recognize Israel. And the argument is that what this means is that in the world, the Arab states have no official connection to Israel. They don't have embassies. They do talk to each other more than you think.
So they have the opposite problem we do, where they all support Palestine and won't recognize Israel.
Right,
Okay.
Yes. And so the United States, Egypt recognizes Israel. That's the Camp David Accord. And every American president has salivated over having another Middle Eastern thing. Like Bill Clinton was pretty damn happy about Oslo. And it's now dead, right? It's fallen apart, right? Like President Trump wanted to do that, right? And President Biden, his plans just went up in smoke. But they want that recognition. And the thing is, it cuts, and that's the fear the Palestinians had, is that we're getting thrown under the bus. I'm saying, we're going to be the losers of this situation, And imagine a world where, what happens if your strongest allies just give up on you and you just stay occupied forever? And that's what they will not. And I said, Palestinians are split on this. I mean, most people over there don't want to kill people. Do not think it. Don't think that Palestinians are actually. You may see these videos on Twitter, but Palestinians are not celebrating the death of people. And I think most Israelis are not celebrating the death of Palestinians. But what do we now have? And that's our twisted media environment, right? Because it's just it's designed in the back there.
I did want to ask about that. The Israeli population. What is Netanyahu's now been in power for essentially almost 3 decades.
A long time, yes. Yeah, too long.
What is the sentiment towards him? Because just months ago, they were having protests about the constitutional crisis there and the gutting of courts.
Oh, he's dead in the water. And the problem is, he barely, what has happened is the collapse of the Israeli Labor Party over the years has basically in fact, Israel has been actually going through a lot of elections recently. They can't form a stable coalition. So they're a full-on parliamentary government that has to have a coalition of parties, and there's 100 parties, right?
It's been going on for about 2
Yeah.
years now.
Yeah, exactly. It's been going on because the Israeli left collapsed. So Netanyahu barely squeaks by now, right? He basically, every election becomes him squeaking through. And he only squeaks through with the Israeli settlers, which he's now beholden to. But the Israeli settlers are not like the rest of the Israelis. And remember, part of the Netanyahu shtick is like, I'm going to keep you safe. That's gone now. So if there was any waffling moderates that were like, yeah, well, like he's kind of a corrupt, but like he keeps us safe, that's out the window. The Israeli left is slowly like, what I'm saying? Like, I've always said this, like, my discussions with Israeli citizens have always been better about talking about Palestinians than with Americans. Because the Americans have always dealt with either pretend the Palestinians don't exist, like Newt Gingrich, or somehow tied into Jesus. And I'm serious, I hate saying it like that. Like that's not an anti-religious statement in any way, shape, or form. And it's like, and you talk to these people and you say, well, what about the Israeli? Like, look, the Israeli, like, I actually show a video with like these former Israeli, like their intelligence chiefs, a whole bunch of them. And they're like, yeah, we know why the Palestinians attack us. In fact, one guy said, I would do it too if I were in their position. They're realists. They know exactly what they're doing. But I think what's going on is that the complexity is that there is a growing consensus. And like right now, the Israelis are all basically, it's a war to them. And they're just in war mode. But when that war mode ends, there's going to be a reckoning in that country. I hope. But I'm not Israeli, I'm an American. And to go back to your question, we have to, then we think, it's like, what can Americans do about that? Yes?
The current state of the Israeli military, do they actually need additional American help to carry out?
No, I don't think they do. Though I'm going to, like, they are now, loitering on the outsides of Gaza City. There are many scenarios in how that can go. And there's a scenario, basically, it's called Stalingrad. Because the Hamas is basically dug in to all kinds of secret tunnels. And it would literally be block by block street fighting. If the Israelis want to go there, that's the air. But it might not have touched Hamas structures below the ground. And they've been doing this since they've been building these things for years now. And so I do not, like the United States now has 2 carrier groups in the Mediterranean, but it is not, and I can say, I think pretty clearly, the United States doesn't want to touch us with a 10-foot pole. Because once there's an American jet flying anywhere over there, you can just kiss the Arab world goodbye. And they're already hanging on by a thread anyway. I'm saying, like, they really didn't like us for our Iraq invasion. They already had problems with us anyways. Like, you could just kiss that all goodbye. They do not, the United States will keep selling Israel bullets. They'll keep selling Israel weapons. But they will not, and I think what the carrier group actually has nothing to do with Israel or Palestinians. It's to show the Iranians that they're around. And whether that's right or wrong becomes another story, but I think that's all it's there to do, is to let the Iranians know, you stay over there and let the Israelis and Palestinians fight.
So, I guess there is always that possibility of, say, blowback against Americans, either, abroad. I'm sure, like, there have been also attacks against American soldiers in Iraq and Syria.
There has. It's been nonstop rocket attacks on American bases over there.
So this is a lot of blowback.
There were, in fact, do you remember a couple years ago, and the United States under President Trump droned that Iranian general in Iraq?
Yes.
There was blowback from that. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, that Iranian general held these various militia groups in Iraq and Syria with an iron fist. Mm-hmm. And when the United States droned them, they all took off and did their own thing. Like they're not controlled. Here's the thing. A lot of these groups are not necessarily controlled by, Iran isn't an evil genius, like a puppet master. And so every group over there has their own agency. They have their own voices. And some of them are making their own choices to lob rockets, basically like mortar shells or just crude, like Scud missile, right? They just lob them in there. The United States is not going to come, the United States we'll launch airstrikes, and in fact, you may know this, the United States launched airstrikes against Iraq between like 1991 all the way even to now, nonstop. We never stopped bombing Iraq. So the US is always launching airstrikes somewhere. But it won't make the news, and it will not be, you know what I'm saying, they will know, this is a weird way to look at it. There's a strange world of like gentlemen's rules about doing this. I know this sounds weird, but like, you can lob a rocket at an American base, that's okay, and we'll launch an airstrike at your thing, that's okay. But as long as they follow those rules, it won't escalate into something bigger.
I think you've already touched on this. Why wouldn't Hezbollah take advantage of this situation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So Hezbollah is also a political party in Lebanon. And to show you how complex Lebanon is, they have been at times in electoral alliance with Christian parties together. I don't think anyone's picked up the trash in Beirut in the last 5 years. And so Lebanon's a mess. And there is actually a lot of pressure in Lebanon to Hezbollah to not get involved. To not, you know what I'm saying? Because what will the Israelis do? Right? And they have a history of attacking Beirut, right? And they're like, do not. And I think Hezbollah is, once again, it works under that weird rule of like, we lob rockets at you, you fire at us, but as long as we kind of stay within our little zones, we're all going to be okay. Like Hezbollah, here's the thing. Hezbollah could act and it might have nothing to do with Iran. Like, Hezbollah is going to make their own calculations, what they think is best for them. But from everything I've ever read, the Lebanese people are like, please, whatever you do. There's a lot of Lebanese people of all stripes that do not like Israelis. Like I've met a lot of Christian Lebanese refugees that have come here over the years because of the wars, the civil wars in the 80s. They all blame Israel for it. And so if Hezbollah escalates, Israel comes, right? And so they don't want that, you know? And no one wants a wider war. No one wants a wider war.
Doesn't mean there won't be one, though.
That's my point. Is why I don't.
But before I get to you, I will say one thing. What we all have to worry about are all the unexpected things that no one can think about, right? The unexpected, the heat of battle, the fog of war, people making a calculation and then making the wrong calculation. That's how it goes wrong, right?
That sounds like World War I.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, yeah, that's a great. Yeah, it's a relevant analogy and a frightening one, right? Because none of them actually set out to do that, and they all ended up doing that.
So like how you've touched on how one of the biggest incentives they had for the October incentive attacks that Hamas had was to prevent the Saudi Arabian recognition of Israel. And I kind of just wanted you to kind of elaborate on what role Iran is kind of playing in this scenario and why they don't want Saudi Arabia to recognize Palestine, or to recognize Israel rather, and why they're kind of using the Palestinians in their own way as chess pieces to prevent a more Saudi Arabian, American, Israeli kind of alliance.
I'm going to preface that with, I am not pro-Iranian, but I want people to realize that Iran calculates. Iran is not pure evil embodiment. They have their own national security interests. And it is, well, in some ways, there's been a Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Right, and that's changed.
Mm-hmm. And it has changed. And in some ways, it changed that both the Iranians and the Saudi Arabians actually really want, because it helps them both achieve their own domestic agendas. Like, so the Iranian government is probably more nervous about women running around without head coverings as a threat to their regime, right? The protests over that, for example, is ranked higher than Israel. Like, so what I'm getting at is domestic survival becomes the most important thing. Like, their calculation is, like, our control over this country is the most, and so stifling a democratic opposition in Iran. The constant Cold War between Saudi Arabia, the US I mean, the one thing I think people don't realize is that when the Iranians seized the American embassy before you were born, the Shah of Iran had tucked away billions of Iranian money into American banks. He'd been stealing it for years. The Shah, in fact, my argument is the Shah of Iran is basically as close to a frenemy as America ever had. He wasn't a really good friend. And he brought about his own demise in some ways, right? But I mean, he stole money, billions, stuffed it into American banks. The new regime, which I'm going to be on record to say, the Islamic Republic sucks for me, but the Islamic Republic said, okay, to America, can we have our money back that our leader stole from us? The Americans said, no, we still have all their money. And so President Obama had worked out a deal where the Iranians pledged not to build nuclear weapons, and then we would pay them back their money. And this made Fox News because there is no banking connections between the United States and Iran. There's nothing. You literally cannot wire money to Iran. So we sent them cash. Cool. They need to do something, right? And then the other factor is, but they also don't want to give up any control either. The Saudi Arabians are the same way. The Saudi Arabians are an experiment, we'll see where this goes, of how far can you lighten up and never have a democracy? How can, you know what I'm saying, like how much like liberalization can we go through and no one ever say a word about elections? There's elections in Saudi Arabia, but they're mostly meaningless positions, and it's, you know, and the Saudis have to realize that high oil prices are great, but alternative energy is a direct threat to them. Right? That's a direct threat to their own economy. They don't want to get in, like, and I think part of the deal, in fact, you guys, like, do you know what President Biden was promising to Saudi Arabia if they recognized Israel?
Basically the American nuclear agreements to help aid their war in Yemen?
Not to build nuclear energy.
Okay.
To share nuclear technology with them so they could build civilian reactors for whether they do, that's another story, but like,
that's come up before. That sounds familiar.
Yeah. And so the Saudi Arabians want that. They actually,
And they can get it from Russia and China.
And the United States does not want them to get it from Russia and China.
That's right. But the
Yeah.
United States, how many nuclear power plants has the United States exported in the last 20 years?
More than are probably operational in the United States.
None.
Yeah. I mean, but like the technology is that, well, I mean, here's that, like that's a story for domestic energy policy is, if you wanted to get off foreign oil or any oil, what do? Because one argument that you get from isolationists is, well, we shouldn't be involved in the Middle East. And you say, sure. How much control does Saudi Arabia have on oil prices? Significant. So you want to be able to get off that oil, but the Saudi Arabians know that, and now they want alternative energy. But I mean, this is the deal with Iran too about their nuclear weapons. Like their nuclear technology is also for, they have civilian reactors for civilian use. That are not, it's not everything is, so part of what Netanyahu always wants is for us to go in and bomb the reactors, which are all placed conveniently next to either religious sites or population centers. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I feel like we drifted away from that.
Before we take any more questions, are you good to stay for a little bit?
Stay longer.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. It is a little after 7:30, so if you have to leave, no big deal. But thank you guys so much. I see a lot of new faces here. Please sign up for a library card. Thank you so much for coming. I hope to see more of you soon. So
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.
leaving?
Thank you so much for coming.
Do you want your laptop back?
No, it's all right.
Are you
I'll be
leaving?
here till you leave. So.
Okay.
Ashley, are you
Just making sure.
leaving?
No, I'm gonna be here.
Okay.
I just wanted to, I know, like I said, I know it's after time, so I just want to give everybody an opportunity if you needed to leave.
To escape?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How late is the library open?
Well, we're technically closed, but I'm here all night, so you guys.
I'm here all that sad. Are you trapped here?
No,
Are you,
well,
like...
listen, last week I was here till like 11:30 taking stuffed animal pictures for a photo, so I have no problem sticking around for this. You guys take all the time you need.
All right, thank you. Thank you. You and then you, so I'll go, yeah.
I think it's pretty interesting, and a couple of us and a couple of carloads were down in D.C. on Saturday to protest against the U.S. Getting involved in funding Israel. But I thought it was interesting in the last 2 days, I guess today or yesterday, it says hundreds of U.S. Agency for International Development staff anonymously signed an open letter to Biden saying we need a ceasefire. And others yesterday had walked outside and had flowers and walked out and stood on the.
And there was someone from the State Department that publicly quit.
Yeah.
And it reminds, in fact, that reminds me of Vietnam because a bunch of people.
Powerful stuff. I was going to say it reminds me of Vietnam.
Yeah, they quit on Kissinger.
Yeah,
during the Nixon administration.
I wasn't alive for that. Can you help me out here? What happened?
Well, in some ways it gets glossed over because the war just kept going. But like a group of, I think Anthony Lake, I think Clinton's national security advisor is part of that. It has a correlation with today. Is that you have the Vietnam War is a younger generation of people who are like, this isn't working, we need to stop doing this. And they quit in protest. Here, and it ties back to what we were saying, like, I read a really interesting thing about this, is that after 9/11, the United States focused heavily on Middle Eastern experts. Like, we didn't have any. Like, everyone my age that wanted to do foreign policy was off studying Russian. And so after 9/11, they're like, everyone learn Arabic quick. And they built, and this is 20 years later now, right? So 25 years later, you now have an entire generation of people that have expertise in the Middle East that Americans never had. And look at them. They're all critical of US policy in Israel. Because that was not the case. You know what I'm saying? Like, so during the Vietnam War, people were going to protest US policy in Vietnam. No one protested the night. In fact, it's not connected, but the night Robert F. Kennedy was shot was the 1-year anniversary of the 6-Day War, and Los Angeles had a pro-Israel parade that day. And Sirhan is a Palestinian. And they're not connected, but just sometimes you're like the irony of that. You know what I'm saying? Like, there was a giant parade in downtown Los Angeles to celebrate Israel's victory. And so you have a generation now, I think, of experts. Those are the people that you're referring to. They're experts. And you don't naturally come as an American, in case you're wondering to the young people in this room, you don't naturally come to a pro-Palestinian position as an American. Right? You don't. Like, if you've been following this for a long time, it is so heavily, and I'm not going to engage in any conspiracy theories or anti-Semitism, but the American media is pro-Israel. It is. And if you just naturally live your life, you're just going to be pro-Israeli. And so this, as I said, looking at that rally last year, like, that's unheard of if you think about it, and we're on new ground. I think there's going to be a change.
It's actually part of why I'm here is because prior to October 7th, it always looked like Israel versus the terrorists.
There you go.
The media has given no context to this. I mean, it's been really crappy too. It's just
Actually, I think the media's been better than it used to be. Because actually, that might even tell you how bad it was.
I mean, they jump in and support wars like nothing. They lied about. They lied and then apologized for lying about the Iraq War. From the Washington Post to the New York Times, they didn't come right out and say we're sorry. They say, well, we weren't critical enough. We didn't take a critical enough.
Before I get to your question, I will say this: is that when candidate Trump trashed the Iraq War, you knew right? That clearly something had gone, you know what I'm saying? Like that he trashed the entire war, which in 2004 would be unheard of. I mean, in some ways, Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, right, were both trapped into pro-war arguments because the idea of like saying anything after 9/11 that would sound pro-terror. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. I mean, so yeah.
The solution, which is very difficult to this problem, has to be looked at, I think, from a somewhat higher point of view than being pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli. You've got to look at it from the point of view of what can be done to find policies that are actually in the interest of all of the people in the area. And part of the difficulty is that in the United States now we have and we've had since virtually the end of the Second World War, a policy of dominating the world economically.
Yeah.
Through through the, among other things, the use of the dollar as the international currency of trade and so forth.
Yes.
And you have now a movement among a number of countries to say this is not a productive way of running the world. This is not a way that's helped poor countries get developed. And so you have the BRICS operation with now not only Brazil and Russia and India and China and South Africa, but now you have 6 other countries, including very important countries in Southwest Asia, going to be participating in the BRICS operation. And you have another 30 or 40 countries who'd like to join. And they're talking about different ways of handling international trade settlements, including a possible currency, but right now they're working on using domestic currencies for that. If the United States does not support some kind of new international relations, it is going to be sidelined completely in terms of world policy. And that's going to be a problem all over the world.
Your comment, which I agree with, which veers away from the Palestine-Israel issue, is no. I mean, it's true.
But doesn't veer away from it, because if you have if the Belt and Road policy of China actually means some development of the economies of the various countries that are participating in that, and of course the Chinese, the ones who facilitated the potential or the developing discussion between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it is possible that there could be some settlement of the Palestinian situation.
Led by someone. Led by someone else.
Led by somebody else. Right now, the United States is not going to do it. It should, and a world without the United States in a positive relationship is a big problem. But
in the immediate future, I don't see that happening. In the long-term future, that always remains a possibility. And so in the immediate future, the United States plays a tremendous oversized role in Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting discussion about Chinese foreign policy, is that they are reluctant to actually be leaders. And if you look at the People's Republic of China, at some point within 20 years of that country's founding, Mao Zedong put everything inwards, mm-hmm. right? And so the discussion of what does a Chinese foreign policy and economy look like? So the Belt and Road thing is clearly tied in, and it is spreading. So for example, Chinese economic penetration of African economies is growing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you will find, and it does exist, that the Chinese actually come with more strings than the Americans. The Americans give you a lot of money, and then sometimes, if you spurn them, they just go away. the Chinese try to extract things out. It's a transactional. It's even more transactional than the United States sometimes. And they will. They're like in the Pacific Islands. Like, we'll give you money to do this, but then you must do this for us in return.
Well, the United States has always been transactional, since especially World
In
War
some
II.
places, yes. In some places, yes, absolutely. And in some places, not as much as you think it should. Right? Where the United States would just pack its bags and go home and like just lose money.
China also doesn't use domestic labor. They send Chinese firms or Chinese workers to do all of the work that they license out, and then when those companies can't repay, they steal the land. It's just another form of colonialism.
The Russian foreign policy, well, it sees how it's going to resolve the Ukrainian-Russian war resolves. But like for example, the Wagner group, which was a private mercenary group, has basically been nationalized by Putin. And they play a role in that remain. Yeah, in fact, in case you were wondering, which is a little bit of an aside and connected but not, in my African politics class, I was telling students that Africa is really going to be the center of conflict in the future. The natural resources, a growing population, but also ground zero for climate change, right? And so when you factor these things in together, a few years ago, American special forces were killed in Niger fighting Islamists. Niger is also rich of uranium.
Uranium.
Yeah, uranium. And that's the Congo is full of coltan, right? And like things that we need for our cell phones. And so like it becomes looming large in the sense of like overpopulation and climate change will create will create conflict. The United States will get sucked into that conflict. And you'll end up possibly like a Cold War situation where the Chinese and Russians pick one side of the conflict and the United States picks the other. And then you let them fight it out. And so the story of Angola, but the policies, it's like, you're right now the United States, I think, has a complete control. Like if the United States literally just said, we're pulling the plug on your money, that would immediately, then you would have to do something about it.
Mhm.
You would. That's the end of story. And yet, the American domestic incentives for that to happen is zero.
Very useful.
Yeah. And so sometimes, like, what seems obvious can't be obvious, right? When you factor in elections and and then it's sick to think about, right? Because you think national security would be so easy to understand. A humane security, like one that's caring towards people. And yet our perverse, like if we talk about Netanyahu's perverse incentive, Americans sometimes have a perverse incentive to keep conflicts going. So, I mean, right now, like, if you're wondering about Pitt, for the ones that are residents here from Cambria County that come, thank you for coming. I think one of the things, our students are, like, the insanity that you see on other campuses aren't existing on our campus. Pitt Johnstown isn't like that in a lot of ways. But like, when you go to some of these larger universities, which generate 20 to 30,000 students, you're getting a lot more, all kinds of, and I think some of the activism is not helpful on either side, right? To go back to like, we want a solution that respects everyone, people, humans, right? And you're getting this people dragged into the us against them mentality.
Yeah. It seems like you're getting almost a microcosm of Israel and Palestine on the campuses because they're all protesting against each other. Is that fair to say?
Some campuses.
Some campuses.
It seems like
sometimes I think it's overblown. Sometimes I think it's more overblown by the media than actually happening.
That's what I mean. Is it just the media, or is it actually turning into
the Cornell incident? If you've heard about the Cornell incident, that someone had been threatening Jewish students, it was literally a random guy that has no connection to anything.
Oh.
That just was doing it. I think it was like a Chinese American student that has no connection to anything. It was just might have mental health issues.
So it's
and
just
was
flat
doing
out
that,
anti-Semitism that had nothing to do with anything political.
Yeah, it's not political. And so, the fact, as I said, the idea that people are now more aware of Palestinian issues today than ever in my life is a sign that there is change coming. Will change come fast enough? The Chinese coup of working out a deal between the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians
Quite amazing.
It was amazing, and it shocked Americans.
We'll have to see how it develops.
Yeah.
Because you don't really know what it means yet.
You don't. And I do know one thing about Saudi Arabia and the Iranians, and I think the Chinese don't understand this, is they'll eventually always just do what they want.
Well, they have really had great hostilities.
They did.
For many, many years, but they may.
It even predates the Islamic regime. They didn't like the Shah either. So it is a long-term simmering feud between those two, which have been fought with, and that's the Yemen War. The Yemen War is a proxy war between these two groups. You know, with everyone in Yemen suffering for it.
But it is possible that at least some significant forces in these countries can try to get a larger view of the situation than just thinking about their own situations. And you know, you go back to the Treaty of Westphalia, where
remember this? We talked about the Treaty of Westphalia. You're taking that class next semester.
one of the
Treaty of
interesting
Westphalia.
things of the Treaty of Westphalia, and of course it wasn't necessarily implemented well, was that part of the treaty said you have to think of the interests of the other people. If you don't think of the interest of who you think your opponents are, you can never really have any kind of peace. And that was it. And that the Treaty of Westphalia, for all of its problems, helped maintain a certain kind of peace in Europe over many years.
You can go back even further to Thucydides, that all nations are basically moved by fear, honor, and interest.
You can.
Yeah, and
that's
that
different than what.
Somewhat, because I think it is a recognition, which is why this lecture is mostly historical, right? And the questions and answers become speculative, right? The questions and answers become different. Is that I cannot assume that, and this does not mean an insult to the non-students here. I just can't assume that any American knows anything about this. So the context is that recognizing that there are other interests and that people will follow their other interests becomes an important first step. Yeah, the important first step to then resolving conflict.
It's important to understand those other interests, but it's also important to think about how interests between people could find a way to find a mutual solution.
I hope.
Human nature looks prettier on paper than it does in practice.
I think part of the problem in Israel and Palestine is that there are dedicated groups to not finding that consensus.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and that, it's hard to get past that too. So.
I wanted to clarify something too, because I saw on social media before a video of a guy who I think the word, it's not immigrated because he moved out. Emigrated, I think is the word for it. And you have a Jewish guy with a New York accent taking over a Palestinian's home.
Yeah, those
screaming that he has the right to do it, and everyone needs to butt out and mind their own business. So you're saying that's a whole movement, and it's allowed under Israeli law, or it wasn't just a one-off thing?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some. I've not here in Pennsylvania. When I lived in California, I had a student. She was 23, and she had just fought in the IDF. She's from Beverly Hills.
Huh.
And at 18, she hopped on a plane, and her opinions about the Middle East were pretty bad. And so she was always enlightening for crazy opinions. But she went and fought for another army. And so, she was all in. And so, any other questions? Yes.
Do you think that the United States government, not a people, have a double standard in the Middle East policy? For instance, the war in Ukraine and the conflict between Israel and Gaza, democracy, for instance, human rights. Do we have a double standard here? Or
Yeah, of Palestine is illegal and immoral. And so what you end up with when you find American policy being hypocritical.
Imagine.
So that's what you mean by getting people to follow their interests, because if you try to appeal to human nature, it doesn't work.
Or the idea like we, in Israel, see, here's an interesting thing about theory. Like my advisor, I shouldn't even let you guys know this, worked with Henry Kissinger. Yeah, he was Kissinger's teaching assistant at Harvard. And so I got like kind of a very realpolitik thing from him. And it's funny because in fact, it is relevant to the discussion. He's a Jewish American professor who is liberal in everything.
Who, among other things, thought it was helpful to have an Israel contest
Thanks for coming.
with
Thank you.
The Arab countries in order to help create an environment where that all could be controlled.
And so the relationship like was that, and in some ways in the United States, we shifted our support from the Shah of Iran pretty quick. Like we effortlessly shifted our support to Saudi Arabia.
Well, the United States put the Shah in power, I mean,
And they did. And look how that worked out. And that's the story of like the way the Islamic Revolution is framed is that the Americans don't look at it as a truly popular protest against a guy that no one liked. It's seen, in fact, I have to tell students all the time, the Ayatollah came in on a commercial airliner and walked off with 1 million people at the airport waiting for him. Like, people greeted him as a liberator. And I think some of them were saddened later on for what happened. But I mean, the Shah, he was playing both sides in the sense of like he undermined American foreign policy and at the same time took our money, right? And sent a bunch of Iranian grad students here for nuclear power, for nuclear technology. He had every intention of building nuclear weapons. He had every intention of illegally acquiring nuclear weapons. So it's not just, to me, it's not the Islamic Republic, it's Iran. And that's something that Saudi Arabia has always been. So the oil though, like it is, well, I mean, that's my argument I've always said, is that the United States really needs to double down on alternative energy, on green energy, on all forms of alternative, to just stop like relying.
Well, the United States needs to export nuclear technology to all these countries so that we can have energy worldwide.
I am pro-nuclear power, but you will find some Americans that are not.
Many aren't.
Yeah. I'm overall was eventually convinced of it when one of my students went on to go work at the nuclear power agency or whatever. Like she came back and was talking to me, and I'm like, but like in case you watched that Chernobyl, you watched the documentary, like not the mini series on HBO about the Chernobyl plant. Mm-hmm. It's pretty good actually. That never helps. You watch that stuff and you're like but no, I'm very much pro nuclear energy. Because the United States has to get off oil. It has to just get off oil. And that's the game. Like, to come back to your question about that double standard is, the Saudi Arabian government hacksawed a reporter in the Turkish consulate, the embassy, the consulate office, and we just let it go. Mm-hmm. Just it's because we're too afraid. If you really want to get angry at Saudi Arabia, they jack up the oil prices. And then I find stickers of Joe Biden next to a gas station saying, I did it. And then that's what happens. And the fear of the domestic politics on our politicians is amazing. And you can't, and so Israel, when I go back, if you were truly a realist, you wouldn't have sided with Israel. So Israel's got this other element to it, and the Cuban lobby, actually, just to let you know, it's not just a Jewish lobby. There's a Cuban lobby. There's, there's other lobbies in America. There's an Irish lobby that actually sort of successfully pressured Britain sometimes on issues about the IRA. But they do exist. Once again, this is not a conspiracy. It is not anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that Jews control the media. But the Jewish lobby is real, and it has power in Congress sometimes. You know, like I think about poor Rashida Tlaib, who basically is just saying, I don't want people that I'm Irish American. I care about Ireland to a point, right? She's a Palestinian. She doesn't want to see Palestine, and they censored her in Congress. I'm still pissed about that. Anyway, she's not pro-Hamas. She's not pro-terrorist. No. And that's the double standard comes in. Yeah.
We're kind of building off of that double standard that he's pointing out. Like from a pure American geopolitical interest, I would argue at least, we have much more in Ukraine than we do in Israel right now. And I would argue we have the moral high ground over Russia and Ukraine. But I feels like, and it seems like it's happening in real time, that we're losing that moral high ground, and there is like fading support for Ukraine. And part of that, it seems like, is coming in the fact that America seems like it is now taking a double standard on the world stage in these two conflicts. And I just kind of wonder, like, do you feel like that's kind of that's going to play out more long term and hurt us on the?
I think American support of Ukraine is tied into other domestic factors. And if they had different domestic factors, there wouldn't even be an issue right now. That said, like on a realistic level, Ukraine failed in its offensive, and that now the problem is, does it become like a frozen conflict? Does it stay just a status quo thing? And then what does that mean to everyone? You know what I'm saying? Like, how does that mean? In some ways, I think because of the changes in U.S. policy, and it's just time, is that the United States is actually, from what I can glean from whatever sources, the United States is furious at Netanyahu. But it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? Until you pull the money, it won't matter. And Netanyahu knows that.
Why do you think that? That's an odd thing, given the public, at least the public presentations of the United States.
Oh, the very glowing presentations of absolute support?
Do whatever you want.
Yeah, that's not what I read. And that's not like, I'm saying, like, and once again, I'll say that with a caveat, you know what I'm saying? But the stakes are high. The blowback is high. You know what I'm saying? The consequences are high. And it's all being done right in front. The history of Israel and Palestine are conflicts that get covered in the nightly news for 10 minutes and you never hear about it. And so this is in your face. And those protests in Washington are real. And I need younger people to realize that. That's earth-shattering to American policy. American policy was unquestioned support for Israel. President Biden, in some ways, you can argue, is so old, and I don't want to offend anyone, right? He is of such a different generation, right? That his support for Israel is natural. And yet,
I don't think so.
And yet, I think he is trying to push Netanyahu. Netanyahu is like if you break down Rashid Tlaib's censure, a group of Jewish American Democrats helped censor her too. And what Biden, what people say in private and not in front of the New York Times is sometimes different, right? I'll just give you a small example. In my dissertation, I wrote about U.S. policy in the Congo in the 1990s. And, I got access to a group of classified. In case you're all wondering, everything in Washington leaks like a sieve anyway, right? There is nothing truly classified. And Jesse Helms, foreign aid guy, his foreign aid expert. Do you remember Jesse Helms? All right. He handed me a stack of classified documents because it made Bill Clinton look bad. And it's research, so I took it. He was from Boston, so we actually did our little Boston thing, talked about the Red Sox for a while, the Celtics. And I'm like, because I do not agree with Jesse Helms, in case you're wondering. But I'm saying, and then he's like, here's a stack of classified documents. I'm like, oh, thanks. But when you're reading through it, there are subtle differences of what's not presented sometimes in front of us. Yeah, and so Biden. And this is not justified, but sometimes I'm in my extrapolations, my projections, or what I'm guessing here. you know, always has to come with that caveat is that, you know, Biden walks a very thin line all the time. He has zero margin for error on anything, you know, and like.
Unfortunately, Biden is very strongly pro-U.S. dominate the world, and that colors many things.
And so will the next president, and so will the next. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not.
It's ingrained in the office.
Yeah, like.
Not if you have another big financial crisis, and the banking system in the United States doesn't survive very well. You have a whole different environment.
And though this is a little bit different, my fear is, and I think it is a true fear, that the next financial crisis or the next meltdown just leads to fascism. Doesn't lead to like us reevaluating our role in the world. It just leads to us all losing our domestic freedoms.
Well, we started that anyways.
Yeah, well, I know. Well, it's very sad. And so, I mean, I've had, like, you know, as I said, my Jewish American dissertation advisor, like one of my best friends went to Brandeis. Is anyone familiar with Brandeis is?
Mm-hmm. Sort of.
Yeah, it's a basically Jewish. He was not Jewish, but it's like 90% Jewish school. And the discussions there, I mean, like, so I'm like, there is a change in Jewish Americans, and it's real. And it's not unquestioning. In fact, evangelical Americans probably unquestionably support Israel now more than the American Jewish community. Mm-hmm. Because American evangelicals actually have no clue what Israel is. So they don't really follow it, right? So it's just, they don't care. But yeah, to kind of go back to that double standard, yes, there is a double standard. You can't escape it. If you write down the facts on a piece of paper, it's a double standard. And you will find someone that's, when people tell you there's no double standard, that's their bias, and that's the lens in which they put on rah-rah American flags, Eagles, you know, flyovers over the Steelers stadium, you know. Then they smooth that the cognitive, because as I said about this lecture, like when you put the facts together, it just doesn't look good, does it, for Israel?
And Israel could play such a wonderfully positive role in the whole Southwest Asia area under the right policies, because it is educated and has technology, and it can share that and be of advantage to the whole area.
Yes, and yet we're stuck. You know, like, and so, like, yeah. I mean, like, wanted my own policy position is if I was the United States, I would tell Netanyahu, I will take away your money, and I'd lock him in a room and leave him there until they figure something out. But that's not feasible. That's like an imaginary world, right, that we live in, and so that's not going to happen.
He actually just led into something I was going to ask you. Are there any concrete like polls or studies anywhere that show where actual citizens of Israel, Palestine, all these places are personally, instead of just what their governments think? Because I'm getting, the more and more I look into this, the more I'm getting the impression that the governments that are involved don't really represent the people that they're supposed to represent.
True. And when I say that I really believe that almost all Muslims anywhere in the world, conservative, liberal, not even religious practice, they all support the Palestinian people. It's their governments that don't care.
That's very true.
They, you know, and they care not because they're evil. They care because they're people, and they, you know what I'm saying. And there's a long-term connection, right?
They're all people, and nobody wants to be wiped out.
And the problem in the United States is we dehumanize people. Part of ruling the world is making sure that you dehumanize everyone else. And so you don't even, in fact, how do you make Palestinians disappear? You just call them Arabs. Now, they are ethnically Arab.
Or you might call them Muslims, even if...
Yeah, even if they, you know, as I said, like, you know, George Abash is a Christian, you know? And so that dehumanizing language, which is being ironic in the United States, is that the anti-Semitism is that there's an undercurrent of right-wing neo-Nazism, which is skating below the pro-Palestinian movement to serve their own interests. meaning that people are taking advantage of people protesting Israel to actually spread their own anti-Semitic agenda. And they are doing it intentionally.
Can I just throw out there that like that is a really part of the reason we wanted to do this here at the library in the first place was for exactly reasons like that. It's really important, like I think, for people to understand that even if we come away with this and we're like, okay, that was a lot of information, I'm not going to retain all of it, but you get the gist, right? I think we just really need to be understanding that like this is so complicated that sometimes the best thing to do if you don't know is not say anything until you have a good frame of reference.
Yeah.
And like I know that is not, like I see a lot of knee-jerk internet reactions from people who don't even realize that what they're saying is like truly deeply offensive to many people. So I guess that's just something from the library's perspective is like a information sharing organization, right? Just asking to please like use us, reach out. We can get you information if you don't know, because it is a hot mess out there right now. So we really want to help, and just being mindful that this isn't theoretical. These are real people, right? And like we just have to be really thoughtful about how we're talking about it.
Well, you'll be able to see it again on Allegheny Independent Media.
Awesome.
And also to let anyone know in the community, my students can just come by my office. You are more than welcome to contact me.
Oh, I totally just volunteered you for that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, you can. Like, I went to an academic conference in Boston, which is always nice to go home, but I went to a conference full of political scientists, and I tell people, I teach at Pitt, Johnstown. And and no matter what, that's my home. Right? I moonlight at Penn State, but don't tell Pitt Johnson. But they are, I am like, and so like my students mostly come from this area. Right? And one thing is that, and this actually in some ways reminds me of Rashida Tlaib, like you should be proud of where you come from. In fact, I kind of don't trust people sometimes if they're not proud of where they come from. I get suspicious of them. Right? And so when you meet people from Boston and they're not Red Sox fans, you're like, I trust you. But I mean, like, Johnstown has fell in some hard times sometimes, right? I mean, but like, I'm dedicated to this. I might live in Latrobe, but I'm dedicated to this community, right? And so you are all welcome to contact me. You know what I'm saying? Like, like we're not separated from the community.
Yeah, and from the library's perspective, we really hope, I'm so happy to see the turnout tonight. I hope that we can have some more events like this where we're talking about things that are maybe difficult to talk about, or giving some context to things that maybe aren't super clear, because, like I said, sharing information is one of the most important things we do. So I just really appreciate you coming out today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, thank you for your comments. Thank you for coming. Thank you for
I've noticed that you were knowledgeable on several subjects. Is it possible you could do a different subject here again?
I can. Yeah, sure. Give me a subject.